Hello. Hello.
Just been doing a lot of events and been paying attention to like what am I reading right now? I think it'll be fun.
Can
I understand there's some ballots behind. Okay.
it is really good to see so many friends and neighbors here tonight as we come together for the next to the last event outside of our workshops in Succeed Together's 7th annual Montclair Literary Festival. This was our most ambitious festival yet, with 45 events, over 9 venues, and I wanted to give a very deep thank you to our sponsors, partners, and volunteers for making this possible. There are too many of you to list on our board, but most of the sponsors, most of the partners are on our boards there. And certainly, I don't have enough time to name you all, but you are deeply appreciated. I do want to give a special shout out to our collaborating partner, Montclair State University, for its extreme generosity. 4 out of the venues were on campus and free. The university also provided free parking as well as a shuttle from campus to downtown and back, and volunteers. We hope to deepen this partnership next year. I also want to thank Margot and Mochung booksellers for doing the impossible. Selling books at 8 different venues over 3 days was certainly not easy, and I'm surprised I'm still alive after citing all of these different venues. Finally, I want to remind everyone that while this event is free for you, producing the festival is not. All profits from the Literary Festival support the educational programs of Succeed Together, which is a nonprofit dedicated to leveling the academic playing field so that all students have access to free, quality tutoring and academic instruction. Please consider making a donation to keep all our programs running, including the annual Literary Festival. It is such a privilege to welcome our guests, the First Lady of Iceland, Eliza Reid, and author, journalist, Kate Zernike. Come on up. Eliza is a journalist, editor, and co-founder of the annual Iceland Writers' Retreat. Eliza grew up on a farm near Ottawa, Canada, and moved to Iceland in 2003, 5 years after winning a student raffle for a date with the man who became her husband, Gunnar T.H. Johansen. I probably said that wrong, sorry. When he took office as president of Iceland on August 1st, 2016, Eliza became the country's first lady. In that capacity, she has been active in promoting gender equality, entrepreneurship, innovation, tourism, and sustainability, as well as the country's writers and rich literary heritage. Her first book, Secrets of the Sprakkar, was an instant bestseller in Iceland and Canada, a New York Times Book Review editor's pick, and is available for sale after this talk.
Convenient.
Yes. Eliza Reid will be in discussion with another amazing writer, Kate Zernike. Kate has been a reporter for the New York Times since 2000. She was a member of the team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting for stories about Al-Qaeda before and after the 9/11 terror attacks. She was previously a reporter for the Boston Globe, where she broke the story of MIT's admission that it discriminated against women on the faculty, on which her book, The Exceptions, is based. Yes. And just to say, The Exceptions is also for sale after this talk. And that's your way you can support the authors. They come here for free as well as moderators. Thank you so much for making this festival such a success. It's nice to see you all. Bye.
Is that on? Hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Marcia, for the great introduction, and what a fantastic audience. This is just a great way to end the festival. So thank you all for coming out tonight. Welcome, Eliza. It's a pleasure to meet you. We've just discovered that we are alumna of the same college at the University of Toronto. It's very small place. Yeah, very small place. I was telling her that my brother Harry likes to say 6 degrees of separation, but 3 in Canada, because really everyone knows each other. I imagine
like
in Iceland,
half a degree in Iceland.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you might come away from Eliza's book, and I really do encourage you all to buy it because it is a fascinating read. I mean, I can't show you, you'll see all my Post-it notes, but the underlining is even crazier. You might come away from this book thinking that life at the 64th parallel is indeed paradise. Not necessarily just for gender equality, but especially for gender equality. The question in Iceland, as Eliza writes, is no longer whether gender equity is important, but how to achieve it. Iceland has the highest level of female participation in the workforce. It is illegal to pay women less than men. They have a female chief of police, a female bishop of the national church. It had the first democratically elected female head of state. All this with one of the highest fertility rates in the world. There is no social stigma for single parents or young mothers. Every birthday party has no fewer than 3 cakes prepared by the woman of the house. People get mad if television stations don't show as many women's sports as they do men's. And this one, closest to my heart, and I would imagine to Margot's out there at Watch Young Books, the most common Christmas presents are books. Yes, your children don't ask you for Xboxes there. Anyway.
Well, my kids did, for sure.
But you gave them books.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there has been, I believe, only one female president.
Only one female president and only 2 prime ministers.
Yes. No female CEOs of any of the largest publicly traded companies.
It's changed since I published it, but none when I wrote the book.
All right, that's good. And as in other countries, domestic violence reports did increase under COVID. But Eliza's book tells us, it looks at the question of equity, traversing the questions of sexuality, motherhood, the workplace, athletics, culture, and art. She describes it as a unique alchemy of history, people, policies, and luck. And she also reminds us that gender equity is not merely an idle or symbolic goal. The more gender equal a society is, the happier and more productive and more prosperous it is for everyone. So I just want to start by, Eliza, by having you tell us how you ended up in Iceland as the First Lady. I just mentioned to you there was a bit of ballot stuffing involved.
There was
Yes.
nothing illegal, but maybe a contrivance, you could say. Excuse me. I guess there's 2 parts to that. One is how I ended up living in Iceland, having grown up in a small village in Canada where I hardly knew that Iceland was a country. And the second part to that is how my husband ended up becoming president. But to the first part, I went to the same institution in Toronto that you did. I went to Oxford University in the UK for graduate school because I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I thought it was good to procrastinate the real world by continuing my studies. And Canadians at Oxford were a dime a dozen. We weren't very exotic at all, but there was one man there from Iceland. And, this is back in the last century when people weren't flying there all the time and had seen photos of the Blue Lagoon and everything like that. So he was quite exotic. And he was quite funny, I thought, and had a very dry sense of humor, softly spoken, and I found him very intriguing. And so we were both rowing for the rowing crew because I thought, you're at Oxford, we're supposed to row. We weren't very good. And one week there was a party, and it was a fundraiser for the rowing crew. And so the men's members of the teams had cups, almost like this, sort of styrofoam cups that they wrote their names on. And then the rest of us, when we got to the party, could pay £1, and we would get 5 tickets, and we'd put our own names on the tickets and put them in different cups. And then the guys would draw one name out and take the person on a date. And this is a true story. And I remember I had a £2 coin, and I thought, well, what the heck? Even though I'm a poor student, I'll spend £2, I'll get 10 tickets. And I thought, well, this is my carpe diem moment in life. And so I put 8 of them in Goodney's cup. And I didn't put them all there because I thought, well, then I'll be like some sort of a stalker, right? And so I put almost all of them, and I randomly put the other couple somewhere else. And inevitably, he drew my name, and that was the beginning of a quarter-century romance.
Amazing, really amazing.
Yeah.
And then he decided, he was originally sort of a political consultant, right? And
he's a historian. He's a sort of nerdy professor type. He finished his PhD, wrote books, and was a lecturer and professor at the University of Iceland. And one of his areas of expertise is the presidency of Iceland. And he was actually writing a book on the presidents of Iceland. And in 2016, the Panama Papers scandal broke at the beginning of April, which was the scandal that implicated some world leaders in offshore tax havens. And in Iceland, I know that in book talks you really want to hear about civics from other countries, but I have to give you a small lesson. We have a president who is the head of state, which is generally a non-political, non-partisan role, kind of a unifying figure, but an elected position. We also have a prime minister that is a political role. The prime minister is a member of a political party, is the head of government. So in 2016, when the Panama Papers scandal broke, the prime minister at the time was implicated in the scandal. He was on the cover of your esteemed newspaper, in fact, that day. And it was a huge political crisis in Iceland. He ended up resigning. And so the television news, the state-run television broadcaster decided to cut to live commentary on what was going on, and they needed a neutral pundit to analyze the situation. And they called my husband. And he appeared on television for 6 hours that day or something, talking about what was going on. And by sheer coincidence, there was a scheduled presidential election for the end of June that year. So this is the beginning of April 2016, also an election year here. Yeah. And, but this 3-month period, and the outgoing president had already said he wasn't going to run again. So the field was kind of open, but none of the declared candidates had really captured the public's imagination. And all of a sudden, people saw this man on television who was smart and neutral and articulate, and they said, he might be good at this job. And they literally started calling our house in the span of a week. So, and that is as surreal as you can imagine it is. And so from early April, he declared that he was running on the 5th of May, which was actually my 40th birthday at the time. I like to think it was an excuse not to take me to Paris, as I had asked. But he declared that he was running on the 5th of May, and the election was the 25th of June. Amazing. And he won.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you also have 4 children and 1 stepchild.
Correct.
And you say that's not unusual in Iceland.
That's right. It's very common to have mixed families, for people to, it's a very sort of small L liberal society. There aren't, as I said, the vast majority of children are born to parents who aren't married first. About, 70, 80% probably, if it's a first child, are not married, because there isn't really any stigma, and nobody changes their names if they get married. So you wouldn't really have any way of knowing if a couple were married or not. And people often had children at a younger age, because again, there's little stigma. So if you got pregnant when you were at college, it didn't mean you would have to stop going to college, for example. So sometimes people have children quite young. Maybe then they split up with that partner, they have another partner, they have children later on. So the fact that I have a stepdaughter is very, very normal. And then my husband and I have 4 children together. And I've often said that if we'd lived in Canada, I'm sure we would never have had 4 children because we couldn't have afforded it. And it just, it's a small country, of course, but it's because there's paid parental leave for both parents and subsidized childcare and all this, it really helps to enable you to decide yourself rather, if you want to have a large family rather than if you can afford to have a large family.
Right, and I was going to say the other assumption is that that women will work and have careers, that it's not an impediment. So I just wanted to go over some of the policies you talked about. You talked about the generous parental leave, but there's free prenatal care. Parental leave is not just parental leave, but you get government payments for parental leave. Is that right?
Right. So it's a system. It's always being enhanced and expanded. When I had my first child almost 16 years ago, it was a policy of 3 months for one parent, 3 months for a second parent, and then a third 3 months that you could split either ways. And that's called use it or lose it, meaning that one parent can't take all of the leave, to encourage both parents to take the leave. It's paid for by the government at 80% of your average salary over the last couple of years, up to a ceiling as well. So if you're Bjork the singer and you're earning $1 skrillion a month, the government doesn't pay you that much per month. But, and it's paid for by the government, subsidized through our taxes, of course, but that means as well that if you are freelance, like I was working freelance a lot, you still get those payments when you take the leave.
So much of when I was reading the book, so much of it is, I kept thinking like, okay, there are all these policies that are very generous. So subsidized childcare, licensed, you talk about childminders who are all licensed childcare places for before school age, and then after school care, which includes subsidized horseback riding and circus lessons. I mean, it's really quite astonishing.
Those are kind of extreme examples, but
right,
the idea is that
still,
municipalities, in order to, this was an initiative that started in the late 90s, I guess, that was designed to reduce teenage drinking and drug use, and the idea was that, maybe if you play on the soccer team, you are less likely to start drinking when you're 13 or something. Right. And Iceland actually went, there's a whole campaign, but this was one component of it. And Iceland went from having one of the highest teenage substance abuse rates to the lowest in Europe. And one of those was this idea of getting kids involved in sporting or music or any kind of after-school activities, like horseback riding. And municipalities subsidize roughly the cost. Horseback riding would be more expensive, but soccer, music, basketball or something for one student per year. So that the idea is that it helps keep you involved in these after-school activities for longer.
So some of the questions, it seems to be a matter of policy, but the culture seems different, right? Like you talk about men being equal partners at childbirth classes, and that because men take the parental leave, there's less stigma for women who want to take it in the workplace. So I'm just sort of curious how much you think. But you also talk about women still bearing the mental load. I think here we call it emotional labor of raising kids. Yeah. So how much do you feel like the culture is just from what you knew in Canada or what you think of here?
Well, one of the first vignettes that I talk about in my book at the very beginning is a memory that sticks with me from when I first moved to Iceland 20 years ago, which was that I got a job for a very small software startup company. So very male dominated. I think I was the fourth woman, and then we were 25 at the company. But the chair of the board of the company was a woman. And one day I was walking by the meeting room and she was chairing a meeting and she was breastfeeding her baby that she just had. And if you chair the board of the company, you're probably on maternity leave, but maybe not from doing that. And she's just nursing the baby and nobody cared. Nobody was making an awkward joke or looking away. And even though at the time having children wasn't at all on my radar, I remember thinking, I don't know that this would happen in Canada like this. Yeah. And certainly I see as well, because fathers tend to take paternity leave, that they do get involved from an earlier age. It's very common to see fathers pushing strollers downtown or taking kids to the park or the swimming pool or doing various activities with the kids. And I know, in my household, I tend to look after the music side of the lessons and who's got this practice, and my husband looks after who's got the soccer tournament and who's going to this part, and we sort of divide it that way. But that is, as I said, I'm always a bit careful to say that we aren't a paradise. We're always working to improve, and I'm sure we'll talk later about areas where we can improve, but one of those is that mental load, still the idea that who's remembering that it's cousin so-and-so's birthday, and who's remembering that this best friend has an allergy to that, so if they're having a sleepover, and have we remembered to pack the right shoes for this trip and all, and that's very time consuming.
Yeah. What about, there was that episode where you talk about a female member of parliament who, she's a young child, an infant still, and she thinks she's timed it perfectly, the baby's asleep, and she's about to get up and speak, and then of course, as parents know, the baby wakes up at the worst possible moment, and she ends up having to breastfeed as she is giving a
speech in Parliament. Yes.
So you talk about the reaction was crazy, but what was the reaction? Was the astonishment outside Iceland, or was it also in Iceland?
I think it was both places. So apparently it was the first time that it had ever happened in Iceland. She didn't think anything of it, she said, at the time, because as any, nursing mother would know, the options of like ripping your child away screaming or just quietly nursing and nobody hears a thing, it isn't really a choice. And as she said, I think in the book, something like, of course, if your child's hungry, you're going to give it something to eat, whether that's a sandwich or breast milk or whatever it is. And she just spoke for a minute and a half while she's holding her baby. And then she went and sat down, and when she left the chamber, that's when, everything blew up on her phone, and it was all over the news, it was international headlines, and so that was a big sort of 15 minutes of internet fame, yeah.
You talk about, so some of the things, I mentioned this bit at the beginning, but so in the United States, the labor force participation for women is 56%, in Canada 61%, in Iceland it's 75%, which is really striking, and I imagine that that is a lot due to childcare policies or parental leave and such. It's also topped the Economist ratings for sort of breaking the glass ceiling because of the proportion of women on boards, and also percentage of women with a university degree. This is not all. So part of it is cultural, but this all started in 1975, right? Like you make the point that this took a long time. It wasn't like it wasn't always paradise, and it still not
and
is.
It still definitely, emphatically is not. And I think one of the things that I'm most proud of when I'm talking about gender equality in Iceland is that you will not meet an Icelandic person of any gender who will say, "Oh, we're the best in the world." Stop. Everybody says "but" at the end, and it's really important for us to say, "Okay, we are topping the charts, but if this is as good as it gets, that's not great." We have a long way to go in lots of areas. But you talked about 1975, and in many senses, with the benefit of hindsight and history, we see that as a watershed moment because 90% of the country's women took a day off on an October day in 1975 to protest wage inequality. And not just the women who were working in paid jobs, but women who were working in the home. And predictably, the country shut down. Right. And there were, schools were closed. There was no television or radio. There was no flights. The newspapers couldn't be printed. The hot dogs sold out because all the men. And my husband remembers this. He said, "Oh, my dad cooked supper that night, and it was awful. He burnt all the hot dogs."
The grocery stores ran out of hot dogs because men rushed to the grocery store to buy hot dogs because that's all they knew how to cook.
And clearly they couldn't even cook that because that's what my husband remembers, is how bad the hot dogs were. So, but that, and I don't know that the next day people said, "Aha, this is it, everything is going to change now." But, with the benefit of hindsight, it was only 5 years later that we elected the first female president in the world who served for 16 years. And also, and I don't talk about it too much in the book, but there was a women's list that was created to elect members, first to municipalities and then to parliament. So for another little civics lesson for you, the Icelandic parliament is a proportional representation party list system rather than each representing constituencies. And women just weren't getting elected. And people were saying, well, I don't know if you've heard this kind of story before. It's because they're not running, it's not our problem. And the woman said, well, we're going to form our own party, and I bet you will get elected. And they did. And that really helped to galvanize and have the other more traditional parties put women on their lists and on their lists in higher positions. And that's why we have now 47.5% women members of parliament, which is the highest non-quota in the world.
Wow. So you were also the first country in the world to make it, as I said, illegal to pay women less than men. There's also, this was astonishing to me, there are gender quotas for corporate boards.
Yes.
That was passed in 2013. any company with more than 50 employees has to have a split of at least 60-40 male-female. How did, you say it's not, it sort of hasn't been entirely observed, but how did that happen?
I think that was this idea that people realized that gender equality doesn't happen of its own accord, and sometimes if you just leave it up, if you're not always thinking about it, not always pushing for it, it just moves far too slowly. And the other Nordic countries, many of them also have introduced quotas as well. And it wasn't, there's more women at universities, for instance, than there are men. It's not for a lack of qualified women to do positions. It's just that I think it's often human nature that, if we're looking for people to sit on our, we tend to think of people who are like us, when in fact we should be thinking of people who exactly aren't like us, so that we have more diversity. And so this was introduced, but as I do mention a little bit in the book, it's, it's sort of to varying degrees of success, because if you had a board already that didn't have gender balance, you didn't have to immediately change. It was sort of for new boards that were created. Some boards are very, you have to be of a certain size, or it's, but what it has helped to do is kind of just help to also push the social norms surrounding it, so even if you don't have to, and that's the same with the law on proving equal pay. A lot of companies, as soon as they got that certification, to say we are doing this, can use that as a recruitment tool, as an advertising tool, to show that they're sort of responsible corporate citizens in that sense.
So how much is it, how much pushback was there to that proposal, for instance, to the quotas? To the quotas?
I don't remember very much when that was introduced. Yeah. I'm saying this very much anecdotally, so not based on specific research that I did. My sense is that maybe not so much pushback to the concept of it, but potentially pushback to, well, will it achieve what it set out to achieve? Right. I think if you were a politician, again, I say this purely anecdotally, who was against that proposal in Iceland, it wouldn't be very popular for you to say, we shouldn't have these rules, but you could say, we're not achieving, these objectives right. by doing it this way. And it hasn't really been introduced for long enough to know if it has been that effective.
Right, okay. You talked about sort of the but, we're not there yet. So it's among some of the caveats to this, you say that it's still the same few women who are serving on boards, right? That's right. One thing. Women still do earn less than men, despite the law making it illegal. Women are only 13% of CEOs in the top 800 companies, and only 11% of people running the largest funds, and only 1.4% of funding from private investment firms goes to companies that are owned or started by women. You also talk, I thought the chapter on media was really striking about, you still see mostly male commentators, and even the who you see interviewed, right? It's only 30% women.
Well, yeah. Now I can't remember my own statistics from my book that I wrote a couple years ago. But I know that the state media, for instance, do examine that to look at it, because again, if you don't think about it, it doesn't really happen. Like you could instinctively say, "Oh yeah, I'm sure we have gender balance on this," and then you go and count, and you realize it's not there, because we're so used to seeing a dominance of men in so many spheres that if you actually had 50-50. It wouldn't even look quote unquote normal to you. Yeah. And so RÚV, the state broadcaster, for instance, they will go through their programs and say, well, out of everybody that you interviewed last month, what's the gender balance on that? And there would be an outcry if you just had men or you didn't have balance in terms of the media subjects. And you were talking a little bit about the statistic on investment there as well. Yeah,
so investments in companies.
Yeah, so there are, and that's why I said sort of private investments, because again, there's more quotas now if it's a state-led investment fund too, to encourage that. But these are sort of areas where, we're still trying to work to improve.
And I kept being struck too when I was reading, because of course I was reading it thinking like, well, how would this apply to the United States or elsewhere? And, we've joked about this, but how small a country it is. But the woman, for instance, from your first job, right, who was breastfeeding her child, ends up running against your husband.
Yes, she came in second. Yeah. That's Iceland for you.
Right. So it's a country the size of Anaheim, California, right?
Yeah.
Or slightly smaller.
360,000, I think now. Mm-hmm. So but it's the size of Kentucky in land, so it's much bigger than.
How much do you think that? I think you refer some point, you talk about how it's a speedboat, it's not an ocean liner. So how much is it easier to turn issues like this around in a small country? How much can you really scale up, as we
Right.
say?
I mean, there's advantages and disadvantages. And I think a lot of people, I get this question a lot when I'm in the States, that people say, okay, it's easy for you because you're not a very diverse country and you're way smaller. So of course this is faster. I always speak back against the diversity argument because in fact we're much more diverse, albeit recently, but we're much more diverse than we have been, and in fact have a much higher proportion of foreign-born residents than the United States does. But when it comes to the size, I would just say there are advantages and disadvantages. You know, the advantages, as you say, are, okay, we can institute this policy of quotas and we can pretty quickly track how it is. But as I always say too, you're a limited resource pool in terms of money, in terms of people and brain power and things. And you know, if you look at a country like the United States, which has, you know, by far the wealthiest country in the world, and also just in terms of human resources and brain power and ideas, I know that it's hard to come to agreement and arrangement on things. Understatement.
Understatement, yeah.
But, you know, so I would say in some senses it's an advantage, but I think it's also just this idea of recognizing that working towards greater equality is something that benefits people of all genders. It doesn't just benefit, it's not a zero-sum game that benefits one group at the expense of another.
Yeah. Yeah, I was also thinking just in terms of one of the hurdles for women running for office in this country is they can't raise the money, right? So, you know, women don't give money and men don't give money as often to women. So it seems like shorter elections and much,
I mean, there's very, very strict campaign finance rules. So money in that sense isn't an issue. I mean, I know that when my husband Goodney was thinking about running and the biggest issue for us was, will we ruin our children, you know, and, but was never, can we afford it? Because we didn't have to really, I had to buy new clothes, to buy a lot of clothes. But we didn't really have to spend any money. You know, we didn't have to remortgage our house or anything like that. Because there's such strict regulations in terms of what you can spend. And I think that makes a big difference. And then the candidate is also not spending all of their time trying to solicit money.
Right, exactly. As I said, I was really struck by, the other thing I kept thinking of is how much of this is cultural and how much can you actually legislate. And so on the question of the culture and how much you can really change the culture, I was really struck by that story of these, I think it's legislators who go into this bar and they're taped, right? And so can you tell us that anecdote?
Yes, that's in my chapter on politics. And again, it's meant to show that we're not a paradise. I deliberately, so the book is really comprised of interviews with about 40 different women who really talk about what it is to be, you know, a mother or a business person or whatever it is in Iceland. And so in my chapter on politics, I didn't want to speak to any national politicians simply because I'm serving as First Lady and I thought it would be awkward, but I did speak to the mayor of a small town who was the first woman elected mayor of her community, and also because she'd formed her own party to run. But in 2018, now in the fall of 2018, I tell the story of four politicians, one a former prime minister, he of the Panama Papers scandal, in fact, one a former foreign minister, and two or three other sitting parliamentarians. And as you do sometimes on a Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m., they skipped out of Parliament and went to a bar. And
Iceland.
Yeah, across the street, and they started drinking. And they had enough to drink that they were talking very loudly, but it being 3 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, there weren't really any other patrons in the bar except one woman who they wrote off as some tourist that couldn't understand what they were saying. But as it turned out, she was not a tourist. And she was so offended by their language and what they were saying that she took out her old cracked iPhone or Samsung or whatever it was and just hit record and left it there. And then she gave it to the media. And I'm not gonna tell you what they said here because I don't have a vocabulary like that. But I did write it in the book after going through edit, trying to use euphemisms for it. And I thought, no, it's much more powerful if I just quote them directly. And but talking about, among others, well, this is actually one of the lightest statements. The former mayor who had interviewed that she was much less hot than she used to be, and therefore they didn't think she'd be as successful. But also about other cabinet members and women that they ran with in politics. And again, that really caused a
One
lot
of them-
Some of them are still members of parliament, of course.
Well, but also one of them had written the UN, had sponsored the UN.
He for she movement, yes,
Yeah.
the former foreign minister. True. Yeah.
So again, it's very, is it hard, is it harder? Because that's my sense, it's harder anywhere you are to change
those
what people
attitudes.
are
Well,
thinking.
it just shows you that those attitudes also exist in Iceland, right? And a lot of the discussion, I don't need to go over it here in the States. So they'll say, oh, that's just locker room talk. That's just how guys talk together. And I was thinking, well, I know a lot of guys and I don't think any of them talk like that. But, that just shows that it isn't something that's universal and that's easy and that we can forget about. And it does, and it causes a lot of damage. I interview another woman who was head of the student union at the University of Iceland, who said, after I saw this, I thought, why should I ever try to go into politics? These aren't the kind of people I want to work with. Yeah. And again, many of these people are still serving members of parliament that have been reelected in elections since then.
Yeah. You do talk a little bit about, you said earlier, it's not that women don't, you can't find women to run for office or whatever, but you do talk a little bit about how women, just to your last point, get discouraged by these things or think I'm not going to speak up or maybe I'm not the expert. How much do you think that is?
I think so. There is strength in numbers. So we are at an advantage in the sense that we have this high percentage of women in parliament. Many of them are young, and there's a lot of ageism there, I think, both within Iceland and abroad. Our foreign minister, for example, she is, I think, about 36 years old. And every time she travels abroad, people say, how can you manage this with your kids? And she says, I think actually there's quite a few foreign ministers that have kids. And it's just that they're never asked how they can manage it. So I think that still exists, but the fact that there are more women in parliament helps to provide solidarity for them as well, and areas where they can commiserate, and sort of that always kind of crosses party lines. Yeah. But one area that is a challenge, and I think everywhere, as we know, is the online environment. We know that there's a lot more targeting of women online. In Iceland, again, it's a little different because of the Icelandic language. So although ChatGPT is now learning Icelandic, it's the second language, so maybe it's going to get worse with bots. But, it was kind of this barrier that you could spot things that were fake because of the Icelandic language. But there's still, again, a lot of, any level of online abuse is too much, really. So, and women are targeted for that more, obviously. So, and of course it serves to silence women's voices. Sometimes you look and you see what people have to put up with. I think, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't. And I can't judge any woman who says, look, I don't want to do this for that reason. You can't say, you've got to do it for this reason. But we need people to be brave like that, obviously. Yeah.
One of the things I love about the book was that you at several points, including right at the end, sort of the message you leave us on is, it's okay if your 3 cakes for the birthday party aren't perfect. There is
right.
sort of, you have to sort of.
I'm going to tell you, I don't even do 3 cakes.
How many do you do?
I don't know. Well, I do like baking, so sometimes I do a couple, but I try not to set expectations high.
Yeah, but that.
That's my goal. That's the message you should all leave. I don't have high goal.
But that you talk about sort of how women are constantly judged, and I think this is true for women, not men, constantly judged on how well they're balancing work life. And we have to move away from that standard. And one of the things I talk about in my book, there's a woman who's an expert in my book on organization, and she talks about how really it's not as catchy a phrase, but we shouldn't be talking about work-life balance. It's more about work-life integration and how you integrate your family life. And so I'm curious, but it strikes me that there is sort of more of a support system in Iceland as well. And you talk about these groups of women and these organizations.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I hope so. And I have a chapter also on the power of female friendship and the importance, both interviewing elderly women who've worked for as volunteers for years in their communities, as you see here, like we're seeing at the festival now, and really women who maybe aren't acknowledged so much for the dedication that they're showing to this work, but what a vital glue it is to the communities. But also to women, I interviewed a group called the Jellyfish who go sea swimming in the Atlantic Sea in Reykjavik, which is the world's northernmost capital city, every week, and they fundraise money to swim across the English Channel for charity. And they also just wanted to sort of push their comfort zones and really carve out that time for themselves, because it's our, our husbands go golfing on the weekends, and we go swimming once a week, and people say, well, what about the kids? Or what do your husband thinks about that? As if you can't take the time for yourself. But I also think that it's important, to point out that that also shows that we're in this, incredibly privileged situation, that we can take the time out to do that. And on the one hand, I do, try to have this message in the book to say, like, we all need to relax. We shouldn't be so, it's great if you want to have the 3 perfect cakes at the birthday party, and then maybe you can't do something else, and that's fine. And we should be able to choose which balls we're going to drop, because we're all going to drop some balls. Yeah. But that also shows, what a privileged situation I live in, and many other people do, because if the ball you're going to drop is, a roof over your child's head, or living in security, or your job, or feeding people, that's a very serious scenario. And obviously we have situations in Iceland with people who don't have the same support networks, who can't afford to take that 20% pay difference when they take parental leave. Right. And that's something that we need to look at too. And a message I kind of have there is this idea that you can't work towards gender equality for one exclusive group of people. You have to be intersectional in your approach and make sure that we are not forgetting groups that are often more disadvantaged, which is women of foreign origin, and women of color, and queer women, and women with disabilities. And we have to remember to work towards greater equality for all of those groups. Right.
So I'm going to throw it to questions in just a minute. Yes, I think we should, applaud that. I do want to do audience questions, but just as people sort of warm up and think about brilliant questions they want to bring, because I know they will be brilliant. I'm curious, again, as I was reading, what is the role of religion in culture in Iceland? Because I sometimes think that in this country, the gender roles are much determined by sort of religious tradition. I'm just curious.
That's a great question, because, and if I were rewriting this book, which I will never do, if I were rewriting this, if I added something different, I would have a chapter on religion, I think, and I would interview a female priest, because I said the head of, so Iceland actually has no legal separation between church and state. Wow. It has an official state religion, which is Lutheranism. Obviously, it's enshrined in our constitution that people have the freedom to worship or not worship as they wish. Yeah. But a majority of people are members, registered members of the national church, which means they're funded by taxpayer dollars. And you can choose then to be registered for a different religious denomination. You can choose to be registered as other, non-religious. You can choose to have your money go to the university instead. So, I remember the first year I think that we were living in Iceland around the Easter weekend one spring. We'd been away in the countryside, and we drove back, and we got back into the city, and all of the flags, in the government buildings are all at half-mast. Oh. And you see that and you think, okay, I've been off the grid, what's happened? And I said to my husband, what do you think could have happened? And he looked at me and he said, it's for Jesus. And wow. it was Good Friday. Wow. And all the flags were at half-mast. And he said it to me like, you idiot, right. And he said, it's for Jesus. And I was like, oh, he's died a long time ago. But, so in a sense, I say all this interestingly in the sense that in the one hand, Iceland has this religious tradition that you see more, children, they will have, nativity plays in the school. Many children are confirmed into their church. Almost everybody, is confirmed or baptized. Although the numbers who are officially members of the national church is continuing to decrease, it's still there. There's a lot of priests. However, religion is not used as a tool to promote closed-minded views on other people. So you see, again, nobody cares who is married and who isn't married and who is having children and who doesn't have children. Abortion is a question, and reproductive rights that I'm asked about a lot here. It's just not an issue in Iceland at all. And I think that is because people people aren't using some kind of religious dogma to limit, how it is that other people want to live their lives.
So
I did mention, sorry, I'll add one more example there too, about the, there was an ad, I think it was on a bus, no, there was a church that did an ad for its local Sunday school, and it had a trans Jesus on it, I tell you. So it had sort
How
of
did you know it was a trans Jesus?
He had breasts, I think, and a dress or something. And so this was controversial. I mean, this was in the news, and you can imagine what the comment section said. So I'm not saying everybody's like, yeah, we're really progressive and open, but it was still there. And so that's kind of where the level of dialogue is, I would say. Yeah.
It's worse than putting sneakers on M&Ms, right? Does anyone in the audience have a question? Well, so I'll ask another. What to go? No,
you're already.
Yeah. No, I just like I'm desperate. Yeah, go ahead.
I know in a lot of Western European countries, and even in a lot of Western European countries, and even some Scandinavian countries, there's been kind of a drift to the right. And I'm wondering if that's true in Iceland, and if so, what does that look like?
Yeah. Are you talking sort of the populists that you see like in Hungary or Poland or places, and also nationalist parties in Sweden and not to the same extent, but potentially. And I also choose my words carefully because I'm in a role that's sort of non-political, so I don't mind talking about misogyny or intolerance like that, abortion. But those to me are kind of human rights issues, but I am hesitant to talk about certain parties or not in terms of their platforms. There's numerous parties that are represented in Parliament in Iceland, and there's often talk during parliamentary elections of whether there's increase in popularity for these sort of very populist parties, nationalist parties, et cetera. And so you do see dialogue about that, but not to quite the same extent that you see it. And certainly, in Sweden, for example, where they're actually in the governing coalition right now, that has not been the case. And while you're waiting for the question, I'd say we also, I think it's really important for that. It's much better to be proactive in terms of trying to reduce the inequalities, for instance, that often lead to the concern that many people who support these parties feel, rather than have to kind of retroactively try to respond to increased intolerance. So.
Hi, I'm curious about the extended family unit in Iceland as compared to here. I mean, now we're all far flung and we don't have the grandparents around necessarily. Is it very, very different there? It just seems like the
like in terms of distance and things. So it's kind of varies because in the one hand, and I see this maybe with an outsider's eyes, on the one hand, it's not uncommon for somebody's parents, for the grandparents of your kids, their parents to live a 5-minute walk away, or, and people maybe have had kids younger. So grandparents help with the school run or the football practice, or you go there after school. And I think in many senses, there's a lot of that sense of maybe what we all remember from when we went to school. I walked to school alone all the way through school when I could, before we moved to the countryside. And kids in Iceland walk to school by themselves. And so that's kind of there a lot for small communities. But there's a lot of people who are like me. I mean, my parents live 8,000 kilometers from where I live. And there's a lot of other families with, either they have families who live in another country or they live in another part of Iceland. And so, the world is just becoming smaller. And in that sense, I mean that we all travel a little bit farther. So it's much, much more common in the sense now that you would have people more far-flung than you would have.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you can just summarize what your immigration policy is and how easy it is for someone like an American to move to Iceland.
But Susie, Trump was convicted today. Did you hear? Not convicted. He was.
If you are a citizen of a Nordic country, it's very, very, very easy. If you're a citizen of a European Economic Area country, it's pretty easy. And if you are neither of those, it's not easy. Unless you're a professional athlete, you could. I mean, it's again, the type of immigration that if you are not a citizen of an EEA country, then you need to basically have a job offer or have a partner who is Icelandic.
And maybe he'll become president.
Yeah, exactly. Who knows? Who knows?
I was wondering, are workers' rights respected there, or what is the workers' union situation?
Unions are very strong in Iceland. I'm a member of a union, and I'm the first lady. But what's my background in journalism? But pretty much everybody is a member of a union, and there's collective agreements, wage agreements that are negotiated. I allude very briefly in the book to a strike that took place right at the time when I was writing this book amongst the union of kind of lowest paid workers. And that was sort of pitched as a sort of a gender equality battle as well, because many of the lowest paid jobs are done in majority by women. So yeah, unions are quite strong in Iceland.
So what was the coronation like?
Marjorie's asking what the
Tell us
coronation
about your
was like.
Fascinator.
I wore a fascinator. So one of the strange things about being First Lady, and there are a great many, and I do talk a lot about, I mean, you know, the book isn't all policy stuff. I hope there's sort of funny stories about having to Google how to curtsy when I met the Queen of Denmark. And
She Googled it, right.
I did have to Google how to curtsy. And all of these surreal moments that you experience when you're sort of suddenly married to the head of state. So one of those surreal moments is that when the Queen of England dies, you go to her funeral, and then you go to the King's coronation, which is where I've come from, where I was on the weekend. And I'm sorry, I had fancier clothes for that event.
Well, I was going to say, you talk in the book
today.
about how you've tried to change this, and you have some secondhand clothes, and it's okay.
I do. So I did actually on Friday night. There was a reception at Buckingham Palace. You know how it is, and I wore a rented dress. I rented a dress for that because I think that's a good message to support, and I do wear secondhand clothes. And then actually the coronation. This is my other thing since the pandemic, especially, is I don't like high heels really anymore.
Yeah.
They're so. And you see the royals, they always have the stiletto heels and they look great, and I mean, I can't do that. So I had this dress I was going to wear the actual coronation, and usually I've always had heels with it, and I thought I'm going to have to stand too much, I can't do this. Yeah. And then a friend of mine said, oh, you can borrow my Fluvox, which is a Canadian, and I said that, she said, if I would love it if my Fluvox went to the coronation. And I said, great, we'll do that. So I borrowed some shoes to the coronation.
And they were flat.
They were like low heels,
Yeah.
and it worked out fine. They're, you know, no one is looking at the feet of the First Lady of Iceland at this event.
Hello, I want to thank you so much for coming.
I hear your voice, but I can't. Hello.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Sarah.
Hi.
My family and I traveled to Reykjavik last year, had a wonderful time, ran the marathon, or let me say, walked the marathon. And anyway, like a lot of tourists, I became intrigued by the hidden people. So could we pivot a little bit, perhaps, and tell us a little story or two about the elves?
About the hidden people. I'm going to tell you, you're going to be disappointed by my answer.
Maybe repeat the question, because I didn't even
Oh yeah,
hear it.
you were asking about the hidden people. So the hidden people in Iceland is the sort of elves that live in the rocks. And people like to say that all Icelanders believe in the hidden people and the elves and these voices. And I think it's more likely that a majority don't want to say they don't believe, right? But I think it's kind of exaggerated for tourists. And maybe I'll be struck down by an elf when I go back for saying that. So I'm not going to say that I don't believe. And you know, if you have, how many people have visited Iceland here?
Wow.
Wow.
That's impressive.
Interesting. And who wants to go to Iceland? And who has not put up their hand yet? Who's like, I didn't know this time, I don't want to go, and I'm not going to go. You know, I think. If you visited Iceland and you've seen the landscape, not very many trees, lush valleys, lots of rocks, it's very dark in the winter. And, you know, if I lived on that impoverished island in the 18th century that was dark half the year, and there was famines, and there was all these shadows, and it was cold, and you had to take a horseback over lava fields to visit your neighbor, I would absolutely play with the hidden people and talk to them. And So it's a kind of strange, so there's lots of stories in folklore like there are in many countries. And my husband, I know, so my husband was actually raised Catholic, which is not in it's very unusual for Icelanders, but his grandmothers had both converted to Catholicism in the 1920s, I think. And he once said to his grandmother, who lived to long age, who always talked about when she was a child growing up in the countryside in Iceland, that she played with the hidden people sometimes. And he said, well, Grandma, you are a very practicing Catholic, and you talk about playing with these elves. And how does that blend with your beliefs? Because, they don't match. And she said, I only played with the Catholic elves. So there's also a strong sense of humor in the Icelandic psyche.
Which is one of the first things you noticed about your husband, exactly.
Right.
So maybe one more, and then I think we're going to have Eliza sign some books.
Boy, there's lots now. Crowds
Okay,
already.
Now maybe we can do two quick ones. Marcia, I'm going to let you be the arbiter of questions. 2 questions. Okay,
How,
2.
how long is your husband's term of office? And I think you're fabulous. Do you have any desire to succeed him?
Oh, excellent question.
My husband was reelected in 2020 with 92% of the vote, which is, I had to tone him down at home because then they get a bit too, like honey.
Still got to take out the trash.
Yeah, exactly. And so there are no term limits in Iceland. The last president served for a number of years, and there's another election scheduled for next year, and he hasn't made any announcements yet, because it's Iceland, so you don't have to rush to do these kinds of things.
One more.
This is such a cozy place. I think there's probably good hidden people in this church. This is there's a nice cozy vibe here, don't you think?
Nice.
Yeah.
What percentage of your income goes to taxes to support the country?
Oh,
you had
I
to
thought
end
you
on
meant
a
mine,
down
because
note.
as First Lady, I'm a volunteer, so about 45%. Yeah. It's all staggered. I think the lowest, if I'm remembering now, the lowest tax bracket is about 38%, and it goes up to over 50% after a certain income. Yeah. I mean, you got to pay for it somewhere, right? But there's no, that's why we have
Free
a social,
prenatal care.
it's the welfare state model, right? So healthcare at university tuition is free. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If you would like to buy a book or you have a book and you want her to sign it, please go out on your left.
Takk fyrir. That's your Icelandic lesson. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting the literary